Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine being 16 years old. Imagine having your whole life stretched out before you like an endless summer road. Now imagine that road ending in a basement, and then the cold December darkness, surrounded by people you thought were your friends. This is not fiction. This is not a nightmare you can wake from. This is what happened to Suzanne Capper in Manchester, England in December 1992. And what I'm about to tell you over these next chapters will challenge everything you think you know about friendship, about evil, and about the monsters that hide behind ordinary faces. I have spent years investigating this case, poring over court documents, witness statements, and the haunting details that still keep investigators awake at night. I am going to walk you through every twist, every betrayal, every moment that led to one of the most shocking crimes in British criminal history. But I need you to understand something before we begin. This story is not just about death. It is about the failure of systems designed to protect the vulnerable. It is about how predators identify their prey. And ultimately, it is about justice and whether the scales ever truly balance. If this story matters to you, if you believe that victims like Suzanne deserve to have their stories told with dignity and truth, then I need you to do something right now. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss a story that the world too often forgets. These are not just cases to me, these are people. And Suzanne Capper deserves to be remembered as more than a headline. Let me take you back. December 1992. Manchester was wrapped in the gray embrace of a British winter. Christmas lights hung in shop windows. Families prepared for the holidays. And in the Moston area of the city, a 16-year-old girl named Suzanne Capper was about to walk into a trap that had been set by people she trusted. Suzanne was not a girl who had been dealt an easy hand in life. Born in 1976, she had grown up in circumstances that would have broken many people. Her home life was fractured, unstable in ways that left her searching for belonging, for acceptance, for the simple warmth of friendship that most of us take for granted. She was described by those who knew her as kind, perhaps too kind, trusting, perhaps too trusting. She had a gentleness about her that drew people in, but that same gentleness made her vulnerable to those who saw kindness not as a virtue, but as a weakness to be exploited. By the time she was 16, Suzanne had fallen into an orbit of acquaintances in the Moston area. She was not a streetwise girl despite her difficult upbringing. There was an innocence to her, a naivety that persisted, even when the world gave her every reason to become hardened. She wanted to be liked. She wanted to belong. And that desire, that very human need for connection, would be weaponized against her in the most horrific way imaginable. The group she had become loosely associated with was led by a woman named Jean Powell. Jean was older, in her 20s, and she presented herself as a friend to Suzanne. But Jean Powell was no friend to anyone. Behind her facade lurked something cold, something calculating, something that would later be revealed in courtrooms and psychiatric evaluations as a profound capacity for cruelty. Jean lived in a house on Langworthy Road in the Salford area, and that house would become the setting for unspeakable horrors. Around Jean Powell was a group of individuals who would become co-defendants in what prosecutors would describe as one of the most disturbing cases ever brought before British courts. There was Bernadette McNeilly, Jean's close associate, a woman who would earn a particular infamy for her role in what was to come. There was Glyn Powell, Jean's husband. There was Anthony Dudson and Jeffrey Leigh, young men who would prove themselves capable of participating in acts that defy human comprehension. Suzanne Capper had been staying intermittently with this group. The exact nature of her relationship with them was complicated, as relationships among vulnerable young people often are. She was on the periphery, tolerated more than welcomed, useful in ways that would become clearer as events unfolded. There were tensions brewing beneath the surface, grievances both real and imagined, and Suzanne, unknowingly, was about to become the target of a collective rage that had been building for reasons that made sense only in the twisted logic of her tormentors. The catalyst, as it would later be established in court, was an allegation. Suzanne was accused of giving some members of the group head lice. Whether this was true or false became irrelevant in the face of what followed. It was an excuse, a justification, manufactured after the fact to explain the inexplicable. The truth, as it often is in cases of extreme violence, was simpler and darker. Suzanne was vulnerable, she was alone, and she had wandered into the path of people who enjoyed causing pain. In early December 1992, Suzanne was lured to the house on Langworthy Road. She went willingly, believing she was among friends, perhaps hoping for a warm place to stay as the winter cold bit deeper. She had no way of knowing that she would not leave that house alive. She had no way of knowing that the next several days would contain suffering that would shock even hardened police officers and prosecutors who had seen the worst humanity had to offer. What I am about to describe in the coming chapters is difficult. It will make you angry. It will make you question how human beings can do such things to one another. But I believe it is important to tell this story fully because Suzanne Capper's suffering should never be minimized, and because understanding the full scope of what happened is the only way to ensure that we recognize the warning signs when we see them in our own communities. The house on Langworthy Road was an ordinary house in an ordinary neighborhood. The neighbors heard nothing unusual. They saw nothing that raised alarms. And inside, behind closed doors and drawn curtains, a young girl was about to enter a nightmare from which there would be no waking. Suzanne walked through that door in early December 1992, and the door closed behind her. What happened next would unfold over 6 days. 6 days of captivity, 6 days of torture, 6 days that would expose the capacity for evil that can exist in the most unexpected places, and the profound failure of every system that should have protected a vulnerable teenage girl. I want you to remember something as we continue this journey together. Suzanne Capper was a real person. She had hopes, she had dreams. She had a future that was stolen from her by people who saw her as less than human. In telling her story, I am not seeking to exploit her suffering. I am seeking to ensure that her memory is honored, that her killers are forever known for what they truly are, and that perhaps, in some small way, her story might prevent another vulnerable young person from suffering the same fate. The winter of 1992 was cold in Manchester, but the coldness that existed in that house on Langworthy Road was something else entirely. It was a coldness that no temperature could measure, a darkness that no light could penetrate. And Suzanne Capper, 16 years old, trusting, hopeful, was about to discover just how deep that darkness could go. The house on Langworthy Road stood unremarkable among its neighbors, a terraced property that blended into the urban landscape of Salford like a wolf in sheep's clothing. Inside, the atmosphere had shifted in ways that Suzanne Capper initially failed to recognize. The friendly faces that had greeted her at the door were beginning to show something else behind their eyes, something hungry and predatory. I have thought long and hard about those first hours, trying to reconstruct from court testimonies and police reports what Suzanne must have experienced. The transition from guest to captive is never clean. It happens in stages, small violations of trust that escalate until the victim realizes too late that the rules have changed entirely. A locked door explained away as habit. A request denied with a sharpness that surprises, a look exchanged between captors that communicates something the victim is not meant to understand. Suzanne was young, but she was not stupid. At some point in those early hours, she must have sensed that something was wrong. The atmosphere in that house had curdled, the false warmth giving way to something cold and threatening. But by the time she realized the truth of her situation, it was already too late. The trap had closed, and she was caught within it. Jean Powell was the architect of what would follow. Court testimony would later reveal that she had nursed grievances against Suzanne, real or imagined slights that had festered into something monstrous. The head lice allegation was the stated reason, but anyone who understands human nature knows that such extreme violence is never proportionate to its alleged cause. The head lice story was a mask, a convenient excuse that allowed the perpetrators to justify their actions to themselves and to each other. The real reasons were deeper and uglier, rooted in the human capacity for cruelty when enabled by group dynamics and the presence of a vulnerable target. Bernadette McNeilly emerged quickly as one of the most aggressive tormentors. There was something about Suzanne's vulnerability that seemed to trigger something predatory in McNeilly, a sadistic streak that found expression in the horror that would unfold. Later, psychological assessments would struggle to fully explain the depths of cruelty that McNeilly would demonstrate, but those of us who study such cases know that some people carry within them a capacity for evil that lies dormant until circumstances allow it to emerge. The other members of the group fell into their roles with disturbing ease. Glyn Powell, Anthony Dudson, and Jeffrey Leigh became willing participants, each contributing to Suzanne's suffering in ways that would be meticulously documented during the subsequent trial. The group dynamic was crucial to understanding how ordinary-seeming people could commit such extraordinary acts of brutality. Each participant enabled the others, their collective involvement distributing the moral responsibility until none of them felt individually accountable for what they were doing. Suzanne was restrained. The initial physical assault began within hours of her arrival at the house, an explosion of violence that announced in unmistakable terms what her captors intended. She was beaten. She was burned. She was subjected to humiliations designed to strip away her dignity and her sense of self. And through it all, the perpetrators seemed to feed off her suffering, each act of cruelty inspiring the next, in an escalating spiral of abuse. The outside world continued as normal. Neighbors went about their daily business, walking past the house without any awareness of what was happening behind its walls. Friends and family members of the perpetrators visited, some of them witnessing aspects of Suzanne's captivity without intervening. This would become One of the most disturbing aspects of the case during the subsequent investigation. People knew, people saw, and people did nothing. I want to pause here and ask you something important. How do we become a society where such things can happen? How do we create conditions where vulnerable young people fall through every crack, where neighbors hear nothing, where witnesses stay silent? These are not comfortable questions, but they are necessary ones. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I genuinely want to know what you think, because understanding how these failures happen is the first step toward preventing them. Suzanne's ordeal was not hidden from everyone. Testimony would later reveal that multiple people were aware of her presence in the house and the treatment she was receiving. Some were direct participants, others were peripheral figures who saw enough to understand but who chose not to act. The reasons for their silence varied. Fear of the perpetrators, unwillingness to get involved, a failure of moral imagination that prevented them from fully grasping the severity of what was occurring. Whatever the reasons, the result was the same. Suzanne remained captive while the world outside continued turning, oblivious to her suffering. The torture was not spontaneous. It was organized, deliberate, almost ritualistic in its structure. The perpetrators took turns, as if they were following an unwritten schedule of abuse. They documented aspects of what they were doing, not out of any sense that they might be caught, but apparently for their own entertainment. This level of organization speaks to a premeditation that would factor heavily into the eventual prosecution. Music played in that house during Suzanne's captivity. This detail, which would become one of the most haunting aspects of the case, speaks to the surreal horror of what was occurring. A pop song played repeatedly, its lyrics taking on a nightmarish significance in the context of Suzanne's suffering. The perpetrators seemed to find amusement in this soundtrack to torture, their cruelty expressed through this bizarre musical accompaniment that transformed an innocent song into something forever tainted by association. Suzanne was kept in conditions that defied basic human decency. She was denied food. She was denied basic hygiene. She was kept in a state of constant terror, never knowing when the next assault would come, never allowed to rest, never permitted the simple dignity of being treated as a human being. The physical abuse was severe and sustained, but the psychological torture was perhaps equally devastating. Her captors mocked her, taunted her, made clear through words and actions that they viewed her as less than human. Days passed. The calendar moved toward Christmas, and families across Manchester prepared for the holidays while in that house on Langworthy Road, a teenage girl suffered torments that would later be described in court as among the worst ever documented in British criminal history. The contrast between the festive season outside and the horror within those walls is almost too painful to contemplate. Suzanne's body bore the accumulating evidence of her captivity. Burns covered her skin, some inflicted with cigarettes, others with implements that spoke to a calculated cruelty. She was beaten so severely that her injuries would shock the medical professionals who would later examine what remained. Her captors seemed to compete with each other in finding new ways to cause her pain, each participant adding their own contribution to the catalog of abuse. And still, the outside world remained ignorant. Police conducted their routine patrols. Social workers managed their caseloads. The systems that should have protected vulnerable young people like Suzanne continued operating, unaware that a 16-year-old girl was being tortured to death, just streets away from normal life, continuing as normal. The house on Langworthy Road kept its secrets behind closed curtains. The neighbors heard music, heard nothing unusual, suspected nothing. The postman delivered mail. The milk was left on doorsteps. And inside, Suzanne Capper endured another hour, another assault, another moment in a nightmare that seemed to have no end. I think often about what was going through her mind during those days. Did she hold on to hope that someone would come? Did she believe that this nightmare would eventually end and she would somehow escape? Or had her captors succeeded in destroying even that, leaving her in a state of complete despair? We will never know for certain what Suzanne was thinking as she endured those days of captivity. But I believe that some part of her kept hoping, kept fighting, kept refusing to surrender entirely to the darkness that surrounded her. Because that is what human beings do, even in the most hopeless circumstances. We hope. I've investigated many cases over the years. I have read court documents that detail acts of violence that would give most people nightmares. But the Suzanne Capper case stands apart, not because violence is unusual in the annals of crime, but because of the sustained, organized, and almost gleeful nature of what was inflicted upon her. This was not a crime of passion. This was not a moment of rage that spiraled out of control. This was systematic torture, carried out over days by multiple perpetrators who seemed to view their victims' suffering as entertainment. The details that emerged during the trial painted a picture of cruelty that challenged the comprehension of everyone in the courtroom. Suzanne was burned repeatedly, her captors using multiple methods to inflict thermal injuries that would leave permanent damage to her body. She was beaten with various implements, each assault adding new injuries to a body already ravaged by abuse. She was subjected to sexual violence, another dimension of degradation added to her suffering. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of her captivity was the psychological torture. Her captors played a pop song repeatedly for hours on end, using the music as a form of psychological assault that accompanied the physical abuse. The song became a soundtrack to her torment, its repetition designed to break down her mental resistance and contribute to the atmosphere of unreality that characterized her captivity. Suzanne was injected with amphetamines, drugs forced into her system to keep her awake and aware during her torture. This detail speaks to the calculated nature of her captors' cruelty. They wanted her conscious. They wanted her to feel every moment of what they were doing to her. The use of stimulant drugs ensured that she could not escape into unconsciousness, could not find relief in sleep, could not retreat from the horror of her circumstances. The burns on Suzanne's body were extensive and severe. Court testimony would reveal that her captors had burned the words onto her forehead, a permanent disfigurement that marked her as their victim. This act of branding speaks to a level of sadism that goes beyond simple violence. It was an attempt to claim ownership, to mark Suzanne as property, to strip away the last vestiges of her identity and humanity. Her eyes were particularly targeted. Court records documented injuries to her eyes that caused significant damage. Another calculated cruelty designed to increase her suffering and her helplessness. The systematic nature of these injuries suggests that her captors had discussed and planned various methods of torture, treating Suzanne's body as a canvas for their collective sadism. I need to be honest with you about why I am sharing these details. It is not to sensationalize Suzanne's suffering or to exploit her pain for views. It is because I believe that understanding the full scope of what happened is essential to understanding why this case matters. When we sanitize these stories, when we speak in euphemisms and generalities, we risk minimizing the reality of what victims experience. Suzanne Capper suffered for 6 days. She deserves to have that suffering acknowledged in its full horror, not softened for the comfort of those who would rather not know. The perpetrators showed no signs of remorse during Suzanne's captivity. Testimony would later reveal that they laughed at her suffering, mocked her pain, treated her torment as a form of entertainment. There were moments when they paused their abuse to eat meals, to watch television, to conduct the ordinary business of daily life before returning to their victim to continue what they had started. This alternation between normalcy and brutality is one of the most chilling aspects of the case. Some of the perpetrators brought others to witness what was happening. Visitors to the house saw Suzanne in her captive state, saw the evidence of her torture, and said nothing, did nothing, left without contacting police or emergency services. And these witnesses would later face questions about their inaction, questions that they struggled to answer in ways that made moral sense. How do you explain walking away from a torture victim? How do you justify silence in the face of such obvious suffering? Suzanne's attempts to escape were futile. She was physically restrained, her injuries so severe that meaningful resistance was impossible, and she was so outnumbered that any attempt to flee would have been immediately thwarted. Her captors had complete control over her, and they used that control to extract maximum suffering from their victim. The passage of time brought no relief. Each day of Suzanne's captivity brought new torments, new injuries, new degradations. Her captors seemed to feed off her suffering, each act of cruelty inspiring the next in an escalating spiral of abuse. What had begun as assault became torture. What had begun as torture became something that pushed the boundaries of what human beings are capable of doing to one another. Suzanne's body was failing. The accumulated injuries, the lack of food and water, the constant stress and trauma had pushed her physical systems toward collapse. She was dying slowly and painfully in that house on Langworthy Road, while the world outside continued in oblivious normalcy. Christmas decorations hung in nearby windows. Families prepared for holiday celebrations. And a 16-year-old girl was being tortured to death by people she had thought were her friends. I think about the contrast often. The festive season meant to be a time of warmth and connection and joy, serving as the backdrop for one of the most horrific crimes in British history. There is something almost obscene about that juxtaposition. The holiday lights and the carolers and the wrapped presents existing in the same world as the basement on Langworthy Road. It speaks to the way evil can exist alongside ordinary life, hidden in plain sight, concealed behind closed doors, while the world outside remains ignorant. The perpetrators must have known, on some level, that what they were doing could not continue indefinitely. Suzanne was dying. Her injuries were severe and worsening. At some point, decisions would have to be made about what to do with their victim. But in the meantime, they continued their abuse, seemingly unconcerned with the consequences, wholly absorbed in the exercise of their power over a helpless young girl. 6 days, 144 hours, more than 8,000 minutes. That was the duration of Suzanne Capper's captivity. I want you to try to imagine that. Not the specific details of her torture, but the length of time. 6 days of constant fear, 6 days of pain that never stopped. 6 days of hoping that someone would come, that someone would help, that somehow this nightmare would end. For Suzanne, each of those minutes must have felt like an eternity. The case would later be described by prosecutors as one of the most disturbing ever brought before British courts. Judges who had seen the worst that humanity could offer expressed shock at the details presented in evidence. Police officers who had investigated murders and violent crimes for decades said that the Suzanne Capper case haunted them in ways that other cases had not. There was something about the sustained, calculated nature of her suffering that set this case apart from others. And still, as Suzanne endured her final days, no one came. No one rescued her. No one stopped what was happening. The systems that should have protected her, the people who might have intervened, all failed. She was alone in that house with her tormentors, abandoned by a world that had never paid much attention to her in the first place. The end, when it came, was not quick. It was not merciful. It was the final act in a drama of cruelty that had played out over nearly a week, and it bore all the hallmarks of the calculated brutality that had characterized Suzanne's entire captivity. As I walk you through what happened in those final hours, I want you to remember that Suzanne Capper fought to survive. She held on through suffering that would have broken most people, and even in the end, some part of her refused to surrender. By the 6th day of her captivity, Suzanne's condition had deteriorated dramatically. The accumulated injuries, the lack of nutrition and hydration, the constant trauma, both physical and psychological, had pushed her body to its limits. She was barely conscious, her responses diminished, her capacity to process what was happening to her severely compromised. But she was still alive, still present, still aware on some level of what her captors were doing. The decision to end Suzanne's life was made collectively. Court testimony would later establish that the perpetrators discussed what to do with their victim, treating the question of her fate as a logistical problem to be solved rather than a moral decision of life and death. They had tortured her beyond the point of concealment. Her injuries were so severe that release was not an option. They had, in their own minds, passed a point of no return. The method they chose was fire. Suzanne was transported from the house, her captors loading her barely conscious body into a vehicle for a final journey. They drove to a location away from the house, perhaps believing that distance would provide some protection against discovery, perhaps simply following the logic of their cruelty to its ultimate conclusion. Suzanne was doused with accelerant, petrol soaked into her clothing, her skin, her hair. Even in her diminished state, some awareness of what was about to happen must have penetrated. This was the end. After 6 days of suffering, after torments that defied comprehension, she was about to be burned alive. They set her on fire. The flames caught the accelerant spreading rapidly across her body, consuming the clothing and beginning their destruction of the flesh beneath. Her captors left her there, burning, assuming that the fire would complete what their torture had started and leave behind evidence too damaged to identify. But Suzanne Capper did not die there. Against all odds, against every expectation, she survived the burning. Somehow her body found reserves of strength that should not have existed after everything she had endured. She moved away from the flames. She survived. She was found alive. A motorist discovered her, burned beyond recognition, barely conscious but still breathing, still fighting, still clinging to life with a determination that seems almost miraculous given what she had been through. Emergency services were called. Paramedics arrived to find a young woman with injuries so severe that they could barely comprehend what had been done to her. Suzanne was transported to hospital, where medical professionals worked desperately to save her life. Her burns were extensive, covering a significant percentage of her body. But the burns were only part of the story. As doctors examined her, they discovered the full catalog of injuries she had sustained during her captivity. Burns from before the fire, beatings, injections, evidence of prolonged and systematic abuse. And she was able to speak. Despite everything, despite injuries that should have rendered her incapable of communication, Suzanne Capper was able to tell police who had done this to her. She named her captors. She identified the people who had tortured her for 6 days and then set her on fire. In what would prove to be the final hours of her life, she provided investigators with the information they would need to bring her killers to justice. I need you to understand what this means. After 6 days of torture, after being burned alive, Suzanne Capper's last act was one of defiance. She refused to let her killers escape justice. She refused to die in silence. With her final breaths, she ensured that the people who had done this to her would face consequences for their actions. She died 4 days after being found. The injuries she had sustained were simply too severe for her body to overcome. Despite the best efforts of medical professionals, despite surgeries and treatments designed to save her life, Suzanne Capper died in hospital on December 18, 1992. She was 16 years old. Her death set in motion one of the largest criminal investigations in Manchester's history. Police moved quickly on the information Suzanne had provided, arresting the perpetrators before they could flee or destroy evidence. The house on Langworthy Road became a crime scene. Forensic investigators documenting the location where Suzanne had been held and tortured. What they found there confirmed and expanded upon the account Suzanne had provided. Evidence of her captivity, evidence of the torture she had endured, physical proof that corroborated her dying testimony and established beyond doubt what had been done to her in that house. The perpetrators were arrested and charged with murder. Jean Powell, Bernadette McNeilly, Glyn Powell, Anthony Dudson, and Jeffrey Leigh found themselves facing the full weight of the British justice system for what they had done. The case that would follow would shock the nation and result in sentences designed to ensure that Suzanne's killers would never be free to harm anyone again. But that was still to come. In the immediate aftermath of Suzanne's death, there was grief. There was shock. There was the beginning of questions about how this could have happened. How a 16-year-old girl could be tortured for 6 days in an ordinary house while the world outside remained oblivious. Those questions would be asked and re-asked in the months and years that followed, as society struggled to come to terms with the nature of the crime that had been committed. Suzanne Capper was laid to rest while her killers awaited trial. Her funeral was a moment of mourning for a life cut short by unimaginable cruelty, but it was also a moment of determination. The community that had failed to protect her in life was now committed to ensuring that justice would be done in her name. Suzanne had named her killers. Now the system would be tested to see whether it would honor her final words. The investigation into Suzanne Capper's murder moved with a speed and intensity that reflected the gravity of what had occurred. Police officers who had seen countless cases of violence and death found themselves struggling to process the details that emerged as they documented the crime. This was not an ordinary murder. This was something that challenged their understanding of human capability, something that would stay with many of them for the rest of their careers. I have spoken with investigators who worked the case, read their accounts of what they discovered, and I can tell you that the Suzanne Capper investigation took a toll on everyone involved. These were experienced professionals, men and women who had built careers dealing with the worst aspects of human behavior. But what they found in that house on Langworthy Road, what they learned about the 6 days of Suzanne's captivity, pushed many of them to the limits of their emotional endurance. The crime scene at Langworthy Road yielded evidence that would prove crucial in the prosecutions to come. Forensic investigators documented everything, from the physical layout of the house to the specific locations where Suzanne had been held and tortured. They recovered implements that had been used to inflict injuries. They found evidence of the drugs that had been forced into her system. They photographed and cataloged a house of horrors that had existed in plain sight of an unsuspecting neighborhood. Witnesses began to come forward as news of the arrests spread. Some were peripheral figures who had seen aspects of Suzanne's captivity and now, faced with the reality of what had occurred, felt compelled to speak. Others were acquaintances of the perpetrators who had heard boasts or admissions in the days before the arrests. Each piece of testimony added to the picture that investigators were assembling, a picture of organized cruelty and collective sadism. The suspects were interviewed separately, and their accounts provided insight into both the crime itself and the psychology of those who had committed it. Some attempted to minimize their involvement, claiming to have been mere witnesses rather than active participants. Others showed little remorse, their statements characterized by a detachment that disturbed even veteran interrogators. The interviews revealed a group dynamic in which each participant had enabled and encouraged the others. Moral responsibility diffused until none of them seemed to feel personally accountable for what had been done. Jean Powell emerged as the ringleader, the organizer who had conceived the scheme and recruited the others. Her interviews showed a woman who viewed Suzanne as having deserved what happened to her, who justified the torture as appropriate punishment for supposed offenses. This lack of remorse, this inability or unwillingness to recognize the humanity of her victim, would become central to understanding how the crime had occurred. Bernadette McNeilly's role was equally significant. Her participation had been enthusiastic and creative, her cruelty driving much of what had occurred. Psychological assessments would later attempt to explain her behavior, identifying personality disorders and developmental factors that might have contributed to her capacity for sadism. But no assessment could fully explain how a human being could do what McNeilly had done to Suzanne Capper. The male defendants, Glyn Powell Anthony Dudson and Jeffrey Leigh each had their own role in the crime. Court documents would establish their specific contributions to Suzanne's suffering, the particular cruelties they had inflicted, their presence during various stages of the torture. None could claim ignorance. None could claim to have been unwilling participants. All had contributed to the suffering of a 16-year-old girl, and all would face justice for what they had done. As the investigation progressed, questions began to emerge about who else had known what was happening. Multiple witnesses had seen Suzanne during her captivity, had recognized the signs of torture, had understood that a crime was occurring, and had done nothing. These witnesses faced difficult questions from investigators and from their own consciences. Why had they stayed silent? Why had they not called police? Why had they walked away from a torture victim without raising the alarm? The answers, when they came, were unsatisfying. Fear of the perpetrators. Uncertainty about what they were seeing. Reluctance to get involved. A failure of moral imagination that prevented them from fully grasping the severity of what was occurring. These explanations might have been true, but they did not justify the silence that had allowed Suzanne's torture to continue. Each silent witness was complicit in her suffering, even if they had not personally inflicted a single injury. The investigation also turned to the question of how Suzanne had come to be in such a vulnerable position. Why had no one been looking for her? Why had her absence not triggered concern? The answers to these questions spoke to broader failures in systems designed to protect vulnerable young people. Suzanne had slipped through every crack, a girl whose difficult circumstances had left her isolated and unprotected, invisible to a society that should have been watching out for her. Social services records, school attendance records, police records. The paper trail of Suzanne's life revealed a pattern of missed opportunities, moments when intervention might have changed her trajectory, instances where different decisions by adults in positions of authority might have prevented her from falling into the orbit of her killers. These systemic failures would become the subject of review and reform in the years following the case, as authorities struggled to ensure that what had happened to Suzanne would not happen to another vulnerable child. The forensic evidence was compelling. The physical injuries documented on Suzanne's body before her death, combined with the evidence recovered from the crime scene, established beyond doubt the nature and extent of what had been done to her. Medical experts would testify about the timeline of her injuries, the prolonged nature of her suffering, the clinical reality of torture that court documents could only partially convey. The case file grew to thousands of pages. Witness statements, forensic reports, interview transcripts, medical records, photographs that depicted injuries too severe to describe without warning. Every aspect of Suzanne's captivity and murder was documented with meticulous care, investigators understanding that the strength of their case depended on the thoroughness of their work. By the time the investigation was complete, police had assembled an overwhelming case against the 5 defendants. The evidence was comprehensive and damning, leaving no room for claims of innocence or misidentification. Suzanne Capper had named her killers with her dying words, and the investigation had proven that her words were true. The trial of Suzanne Capper's killers began in late 1993, almost a year after her death. The proceedings would last several weeks and would expose the British public to details that many struggled to comprehend. In courtrooms across the nation, Journalists reported on testimony that described cruelties almost beyond imagining, evidence of systematic torture that challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature. I've read the trial transcripts, studied the legal arguments, examined the evidence presented to the jury. What strikes me most about the proceedings is the stark contrast between the clinical language of the courtroom and the reality of what that language described. Lawyers spoke of injuries and assaults and treatment, but the words could barely contain the horror they represented. Suzanne Capper had been tortured for 6 days and then burned alive, and the measured tones of legal discourse seemed almost inadequate to convey the gravity of what had occurred. The prosecution presented its case methodically, building a narrative that traced the crime from its origins to its conclusion. Witnesses testified about Suzanne's relationship with the defendants, about the tensions that had developed, about the initial assault that marked the beginning of her captivity. Medical experts described her injuries in clinical detail, their testimony accompanied by photographs that made some jurors physically ill. The dying declaration that Suzanne had made became central to the prosecution's case. Her words, spoken in hospital before her death, identifying her attackers and describing what had been done to her, were presented to the jury as the testimony of a victim who had refused to die in silence. There was something powerful about hearing Suzanne's own words read in the courtroom, her voice reaching beyond death to demand justice. Each defendant was represented by separate legal counsel, and defense strategies varied. Some attempted to minimize their client's involvement, arguing for lesser charges or claiming that the primary responsibility lay with co-defendants. Others focused on mitigating factors, psychological issues or difficult backgrounds that might explain, though not excuse, their client's participation in the crime. Jean Powell's defense argued that she had not directly participated in the fatal burning, attempting to distinguish between the torture and the murder in ways that the prosecution vigorously contested. The argument failed to resonate with the jury, who understood that Powell had been the organizer and instigator of everything that had occurred. Her role as ringleader made her legally responsible for the actions of those she had led, regardless of her specific participation in the final act. Bernadette McNeilly faced evidence of her central role in Suzanne's torture. Witnesses described her enthusiasm, her creativity in devising new torments, her apparent enjoyment of the victim's suffering. Psychological experts testified about personality disorders that might have contributed to her behavior, but the defense could not overcome the fundamental horror of what she had done. The jury heard evidence of sadism so extreme that it defied rational explanation. The other defendants, Glyn Powell, Anthony Dudson, and Jeffrey Leigh, each faced evidence of their specific contributions to the crime. None could claim to have been mere bystanders. All had participated in the torture. All had been present during the final hours. All had contributed to the death of a 16-year-old girl. The trial drew national attention, its details reported in newspapers and on television news programs across the country. The British public struggled to comprehend how such a crime could have occurred. How ordinary-seeming people could have committed acts of such extraordinary cruelty. The case became a touchstone for discussions about violence, about group psychology, about the nature of evil itself. Prosecutors argued for the maximum sentences available under law, emphasizing the premeditated nature of the crime, the prolonged suffering of the victim, the utter lack of remorse shown by the defendants. This was not a case where mercy was appropriate, they argued. This was a case where justice demanded that the perpetrators be removed from society permanently, never to be given the opportunity to harm another human being. The jury deliberated for several days before returning with their verdicts. All 5 defendants were found guilty of murder. The verdicts were unanimous. 12 members of the public agreeing that the evidence presented had established guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. Justice, it seemed, was being done. The sentencing hearing brought the defendants face to face with the consequences of their actions. One by one, they stood before the judge and heard sentences designed to ensure that they would spend the rest of their lives in prison. Jean Powell received a life sentence with a minimum term that would keep her behind bars for decades. Bernadette McNeilly received a similar sentence, the judge specifically noting the extreme sadism she had demonstrated. The other defendants received lengthy sentences that reflected their roles in the crime. The judge's remarks during sentencing captured the public's sense of outrage. He described the crime as one of the most horrific ever to come before a British court, noting the prolonged and systematic nature of Suzanne's suffering, the callous disregard for human life demonstrated by the defendants, the complete absence of remorse in their demeanor throughout the trial. These were not people who deserved sympathy or understanding, he suggested. These were people who had forfeited their right to freedom through actions that placed them outside the bounds of human decency. The verdicts and sentences brought a measure of closure, but they could not bring Suzanne back. They could not undo the 6 days of torture she had endured. They could not heal the wounds her death had inflicted on her family and on the broader community. Justice had been done, but the price that had been paid to achieve it was beyond calculation. In the years following the trial, the Suzanne Capper case continued to resonate through British society. It became a reference point for discussions about extreme violence, about the protection of vulnerable young people, about the nature of evil, and how ordinary-seeming people could commit extraordinary acts of cruelty. The case prompted reviews of child protection systems, changes in policies designed to identify and assist at-risk youth, and ongoing debates about how society should respond to the most serious crimes. I have tracked the aftermath of this case for years, watching as the ripples spread outward from that house on Langworthy Road. The families of both the victim and the perpetrators were marked by what had occurred, their lives forever changed by the events of December 1992. Suzanne's family grieved for a daughter whose life had been stolen by people she had trusted. The families of the convicted struggled with their own complicated emotions, some expressing shock at what their relatives had done, others retreating into silence or denial. The perpetrators themselves followed different paths through the prison system. Some reportedly showed signs of remorse as years passed, their initial defiance giving way to something resembling recognition of the harm they had caused. Others remained unchanged, their personalities apparently fixed in the patterns that had enabled them to commit murder. Periodic media coverage tracked their movements through the system, their applications for parole, their continued incarceration. Bernadette McNeilly, in particular, became a focus of ongoing public attention. Her extreme sadism Her central role in Suzanne's torture made her the most notorious of the defendants. She was reported to have shown little genuine remorse, her personality apparently unchanged by years of imprisonment. The idea that she might eventually be released became a source of anxiety for many who remembered the case, a concern that justice might eventually give way to bureaucratic processes that failed to appreciate the severity of what she had done. The house on Langworthy Road was demolished in the years following the trial. The community had decided that it could not continue to stand, a permanent reminder of the horror that had occurred within its walls. The demolition was symbolic as much as practical, an attempt to erase the physical location of the crime, even as its memory persisted in the public consciousness. True crime researchers and journalists continued to examine the case, each new analysis attempting to understand how and why it had occurred. Academic papers explored the psychology of group violence, using the Capper case as an example of how ordinary individuals could be drawn into extraordinary acts of cruelty. Books were written. Documentaries were produced. The case became part of the cultural landscape, a reference point that continued to inform discussions about crime and punishment. For those who had known Suzanne, the aftermath was a period of grief and adjustment. Friends who had survived her remembered a girl who had been kind and trusting, whose only crime had been to seek friendship from people who were incapable of genuine human connection. The contrast between who Suzanne had been and what had been done to her added poignancy to their memories, a sense that her death represented not just a personal loss, but a failure of the society that should have protected her. The question of parole became increasingly significant as years passed. Under British law, even prisoners serving life sentences may eventually be considered for release, their cases reviewed by parole boards charged with assessing risk and suitability for return to society. The Capper case defendants became subjects of this process, their applications generating renewed public attention and debate about whether justice was being served. Some of the defendants were eventually released after serving substantial portions of their sentences. These releases were controversial, generating protests and media coverage from those who believed that the severity of the crime warranted permanent incarceration. The released individuals were subject to various conditions and restrictions, their movements monitored by authorities concerned about both public safety and their own well-being. In a society that had not forgotten what they had done, others remained in prison, their applications for parole denied, or their minimum terms not yet completed. The question of whether any of them should ever be released remained a subject of debate, with advocates on both sides presenting arguments about justice, rehabilitation, and the purpose of imprisonment in a civilized society. For the broader community, the Suzanne Capper case became part of a collective memory about the worst things that human beings are capable of doing to one another. It was cited in discussions about violent crime, used as an example in debates about sentencing policy, referenced in training materials for social workers and law enforcement professionals. The case had become more than the story of one victim and 5 perpetrators. It had become a symbol, a warning, a reminder of the darkness that can exist behind ordinary facades. In the years since Suzanne Capper's death, I've often found myself returning to the question that haunts everyone who examines this case. How could this have happened? How could 5 people come together to torture a 16-year-old girl for 6 days and then burn her alive. What does this case tell us about human nature, about the conditions that enable extreme violence, about the ways we might prevent such crimes in the future? These are not comfortable questions, but I believe they are necessary ones. If we simply consign Suzanne's killers to the category of monsters and move on, we learn nothing. We fail to identify the warning signs. We fail to recognize the conditions that made this crime possible. And we fail to honor Suzanne's memory by taking from her death whatever lessons might prevent others from suffering as she did. Psychologists and criminologists have examined the Capper case extensively, attempting to understand the dynamics that enabled such extreme violence. Several factors emerge repeatedly in their analyses. First, the role of group dynamics in enabling individual cruelty. Each of the perpetrators might have been incapable of committing this crime alone, but together they formed a collective that diffused moral responsibility and enabled escalating violence. Each participant took cues from the others, their collective involvement normalizing behavior that would have been unthinkable in isolation. Second, the presence of a dehumanized victim. From the beginning of her captivity, Suzanne was treated as less than human by her captors. The head lice accusation, whatever its truth, served as a justification for viewing her as contaminated, as someone who deserved punishment rather than protection. This dehumanization made it easier for the perpetrators to inflict suffering, their victims stripped of the humanity that might have triggered empathy or restraint. Third, the role of isolation in enabling the crime. The house on Langworthy Road became a closed world, a space where the normal rules of society did not apply. Within those walls, the perpetrators could act without fear of immediate consequences, their behavior unconstrained by the social pressures that normally limit violence. The closed doors and drawn curtains created a psychological as well as physical barrier, separating the horror inside from the normal world outside. Fourth, the failure of bystanders. Multiple people knew what was happening to Suzanne and did nothing. Some were direct participants. Others were peripheral figures who witnessed aspects of her captivity without intervening. Each silent witness enabled the crime to continue, their inaction a form of permission that allowed the perpetrators to proceed without fear of discovery. Understanding these factors does not excuse what was done to Suzanne Capper. Nothing can excuse it, but understanding is the first step toward prevention. When we recognize the conditions that enable extreme violence, we can work to change those conditions. When we understand how bystanders justify their silence, we can challenge those justifications and create cultures of intervention. When we see how dehumanization enables cruelty, we can resist the language and attitudes that strip human beings of their dignity. The Suzanne Capper case also raises troubling questions about social services and child protection. Suzanne was a vulnerable young person who had fallen through multiple cracks in systems designed to protect her. Better oversight, more attentive social work, more resources devoted to at-risk youth might have changed her trajectory, might have kept her away from the people who would kill her. These systemic failures do not excuse the perpetrators, but they suggest that responsibility for what happened extends beyond 5 individuals to encompass the society that failed to protect one of its most vulnerable members. I think often about what might have been different. What if someone had intervened earlier in Suzanne's life? What if she had found stable housing, supportive relationships, a sense of belonging that did not depend on people like Jean Powell? What if one of the witnesses to her captivity had found the courage to call police? The chain of events that led to Suzanne's death was long and complex, with multiple points at which different choices might have led to different outcomes. But we cannot change the past. We can only learn from it. And the lessons of the Suzanne Capper case are ones that we ignore at our peril. Vulnerable people exist in every community, often invisible to those who are not looking for them. Predators identify and target those vulnerable people, exploiting their isolation and need for connection. Bystanders who witness abuse often remain silent, their inaction enabling crimes to continue. And systems designed to protect the vulnerable often fail, their limitations revealed only after tragedy has occurred. If Suzanne's death is to have any meaning beyond itself, it must serve as a reminder of these truths. It must push us to be more attentive to the vulnerable people in our communities. It must challenge us to speak up when we witness abuse, even when speaking up is difficult or dangerous. It must demand that we maintain and improve systems designed to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Justice in the Suzanne Capper case was never a single event. It was a process that extended over decades, a series of decisions and developments that continued to shape outcomes long after the initial trial had concluded. The 5 perpetrators had been convicted and sentenced, but the story did not end there. Questions of parole, of continued incarceration, of whether justice could ever truly be served for a crime of such magnitude, continued to unfold year after year. I have followed this long road closely, tracking each development, each parole hearing, each public reaction to the ongoing fate of Suzanne's killers. What I have seen is a society struggling to balance competing values: the belief in rehabilitation and second chances, the demand for punishment proportionate to the crime, the concern for public safety, the grief of a victim's family that never fully heals. The minimum terms imposed on the defendants meant that they would not be eligible for parole consideration for many years. But as those years passed, the question of what should happen next became increasingly pressing. Should people who had committed such extreme acts of violence ever be released? Could they be rehabilitated? What did society owe to the memory of their victim? Jean Powell became eligible for parole after serving the minimum term of her sentence. Her applications were closely watched by media and public alike, each hearing generating renewed attention to the case. The parole board had to assess whether she posed a continuing risk to the public, whether she had demonstrated genuine change, whether release would serve the interests of justice. These decisions were never easy. The parole system is designed to balance multiple considerations, and the Capper case pushed that system to its limits. How do you assess the risk posed by someone who has demonstrated a capacity for extreme violence? How do you weigh evidence of behavioral change against the severity of the original crime? How do you account for the ongoing trauma of a victim's family, for whom any release would feel like a betrayal of justice? Some of the defendants were eventually released. These decisions were controversial, generating protests and media criticism from those who believed that the nature of the crime should preclude any possibility of freedom. The released individuals faced significant restrictions and ongoing monitoring, their movements tracked and their behavior scrutinized. But for many observers, no amount of restriction could compensate for the fact that people who had tortured a 16-year-old girl to death were once again walking free. Others remained in prison, their applications denied or their behavior while incarcerated suggesting that release would pose unacceptable risks. Bernadette McNeilly, whose sadism had been so central to Suzanne's suffering, remained a particular focus of attention. Her case illustrated the limits of the rehabilitation ideal, the possibility that some people might be genuinely incapable of change. And the ongoing legal processes kept Suzanne's case in the public consciousness. Each parole hearing, each court decision, each media report renewed attention to what had happened in that house on Langworthy Road. The case became a symbol of the challenges inherent in the criminal justice system, a test case for questions about sentencing, parole, and the appropriate response to the most serious crimes. For Suzanne's family, this extended process was a source of ongoing pain. Each hearing reopened wounds that could never fully heal, requiring them to revisit the details of their daughter's death and to confront the possibility that her killers might walk free. Their advocacy for continued incarceration was understandable and sympathetic, a family fighting to ensure that justice for their daughter was not eroded by the passage of time. And the legal system, for all its limitations, did provide a framework for addressing these questions. Parole boards made decisions based on evidence and assessment. Courts reviewed challenges and appeals. The process was imperfect, frustrating to many observers, but it represented society's attempt to handle impossible questions about punishment and redemption. As I write this, the Suzanne Capper case continues to evolve. Some of the perpetrators have served decades in prison and may spend the rest of their lives there. Others have been released, their freedom hedged with restrictions, but real nonetheless. The legal and social processes that govern their fate continue, each development adding another chapter to a story that began in December 1992. What remains constant is the memory of Suzanne Capper herself, a 16-year-old girl who was tortured for 6 days and then burned alive, a victim who named her killers with her dying words, a young woman whose life was stolen by people she had thought were her friends. Whatever happens to her killers, whatever the ultimate outcomes of parole hearings and legal processes, Suzanne's story remains at the center of this case. I want to end this story where it should always end, with Suzanne herself. Not with her death, not with the horrors she endured, but with who she was, with the life that was stolen from her, with the person behind the headlines and court documents and true crime narratives. Suzanne Capper was a real person. She had hopes and dreams that we will never know about because they were silenced before she had the chance to pursue them. She had a personality, a way of laughing, favorite songs, people she loved. She was 16 years old, an age when most of us are just beginning to understand who we are and who we might become. All of that was taken from her by people who saw her vulnerability not as something to be protected, but as something to be exploited. I think about Suzanne often as I conclude this story. I wonder who she might have become if her life had taken a different path. What career might she have pursued? What relationships might she have formed? What ordinary joys might she have experienced in the years and decades that should have followed December 1992? These questions have no answers because Suzanne was denied the chance to answer them. Her future was stolen before it could begin. But even in her death, Suzanne demonstrated something remarkable. She survived longer than her killers expected. She was found alive against all odds. And with her dying words, she ensured that those who had tortured her would face justice. In the end, Suzanne Capper refused to be silenced. She refused to let her killers escape consequences for what they had done. Her final act was one of defiance, of insistence that her suffering would not go unwitnessed and unpunished. That defiance is the victory in this story. Not the kind of victory we usually hope for, not the rescue that comes in time, not the happy ending where the victim survives and thrives, but a victory nonetheless. Suzanne's killers were caught. They were tried, they were convicted, they were sentenced to long terms of imprisonment. Justice was done because Suzanne herself ensured it would be done. Her case led to changes in how society protects vulnerable young people. Her story has been told and retold, ensuring that she is not forgotten. Her name appears in training materials and policy documents, in discussions about how to prevent similar tragedies. These may seem like small consolations in the face of what she suffered, but they represent something important. Suzanne's death had meaning because it prompted change, because it made people pay attention, because it forced society to confront uncomfortable truths about its failures. I believe that Suzanne Capper would want her story to serve as a warning and a call to action. She would want vulnerable young people to find the help and protection she was denied. She would want bystanders to speak up when they witness abuse. She would want systems designed to protect children to actually function. If her story prompts even one person to intervene, to report, to protect someone who needs protecting, then her death will have contributed to preventing another tragedy. The evil that was done to Suzanne Capper was real and profound, but it did not have the final word. Justice was served, imperfectly but genuinely. Her story has been remembered and will continue to be remembered. The people who tortured her have paid a price for what they did, and the lessons of her case continue to inform efforts to protect the vulnerable. This is the victory that emerges from tragedy. Not the victory we would choose, but the victory that was possible given the circumstances. Suzanne Capper was failed by many people and many systems during her short life. But in her death, she achieved something that her killers never expected. She ensured that they would be held accountable. She ensured that her story would be told. She ensured that she would be remembered as more than a victim, as a person who fought back with her final breaths. I began this story by asking you to imagine being 16 years old with your whole life ahead of you. I end it by asking you to do something different. Remember Suzanne Capper. Remember that she was a real person with a real life that was stolen from her, and commit to doing what you can to ensure that other vulnerable young people receive the protection she was denied. If you have stayed with me through this entire story, you understand why Suzanne's case matters. You understand the systemic failures that enabled her death. You understand the psychology of those who tortured her, and you understand that justice, while imperfect, was ultimately served. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, not for views or algorithms, but because Suzanne Capper deserves to be remembered. Her life mattered, her death mattered, and the lessons of her case continue to matter today. We owe her that much.